All right. Well, glad you're here. Appreciate your presence. Hope you've been having a good week. Some are enjoying spring break. Most of you are like, I don't get off, so that's kind of a bummer. But we're continuing our study. We just started last week. We're titled the study Words That Matter. And each week, the idea is we will look at a particular religious word, and we will try to get deeper in the original meaning of it, the way it was used in the Bible. And the reason for it, and the point I made as an introduction last time, but I'll just summarize tonight, is words aren't just a bunch of letters put together. There's kind of a social construct to the meaning of the word. And there's a historical moment in time. There's a lot of influences, cultural influences that really determine the meaning. Not just that, we're talking about a language that was 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Some of it's a dead language, not spoken that particular way anymore. So there's a lot of translation that goes into it. So just because you can make sense of a word in English doesn't necessarily mean we really have the depths of what that word means, or if we even have the meaning at all of that word. Because also, on top of that, the last 2,000 years plus, certain words have carried certain baggages, right? Historical baggages that evoke a lot of feeling, a lot of emotion, a lot of social construct and implications. And so, like the word submission is one we throw out there, and there's a lot that comes to mind, and it's not a lot of it positive because of the way that word's been used and imposed and even weaponized in our history. So we got to try to get past a lot of that to understand what's going on. Added to that is that most of these words are very religious words, or not words we use on a day-to-day, or if we do, they have a secular meaning to it. So even then, how do we navigate and dissect and take a deep dive into some of that? And that's the goal of this series. So I have a list of more words than we'll have class times to cover, but I'm kind of writing that as we go. So if you have a particular word that you're intrigued by or curious or have questions, let me know, and I'll see if I can put it in the lineup of the class. So last time we talked about the word spirit, and we started in Genesis, of course, and how the Hebrew there is the ruach of God. And it can mean spirit, it can mean wind, and it can mean breath. And different settings take on different emphasis. But really the underlining of how the word is used throughout the Bible is the idea of life and the presence of God. And it's a transformative presence. It is a life-giving presence. And it's one that the storyline, it kind of arches the storyline all the way unto Jesus and how we have the Spirit of God in us, and Jesus at his baptism, the Spirit of God comes upon him, making a connection there with Genesis. And then through Jesus, we have the Spirit of God, and we made some applications that way. So today we're going to talk about the word holy, Kristen Lee, I email things to her, she prints it out, and she reads over it. So I'm guessing there's a lot less mistakes. Like, for example, it actually says holy and not the word holly, as my last class implied we were going to talk about. So I really appreciate it. Last time it wasn't Kristen Lee that printed that out, so it didn't get read over. But I'm confident it's going to look better this time. So, okay, our first point every time is, why does finding the meaning matter? And just like we talked about spirit, I want to start with the Hebrew of the word holy. And the Hebrew of the word holy is the word kadosh, which I also find fun to say, right? It's just kadosh. Reminds me of that 90s video game Street Fighter, but I don't think it's kadosh is what he said, but that's what it reminds me of. Kadosh. So what does kadosh mean? Kadosh literally means consecrating, which I found interesting. It's not just something that has been done or something that will be done. It's also this idea of something that is being done. So all three of those, past, present, and future, and this present as a continuous thing, is involved in it. So consecrate it's another religious word, right? What does that mean? It means dedicated. You're setting it apart. It exclusively tagged for a particular purpose and function. Another way of saying it, it's about differentiating. So it's in compare and contrast to, like, the common, the habitual, the profane. And the word profane there just literally means it's common. And so to have something set apart, set uniquely different, it is meant to be singular, as in different. It is awe-inspiring, and it actually also is used in either a terrible sense or a dreadful sense. And I got two references for you to look up there on your own. Because the presence of God, and this isn't just kind of the day-to-day conversation, like, I have 6 apples and, an orange, so that must be holy. Well, that is also set apart. But the emphasis used in the storyline of the Bible is because it's set apart or being set apart or being uniquely set apart because of God. And so the presence of God is what is transformative in taking the common to being unique, of taking the mundane and having it set apart. So it's not just descriptive. You have a bunch of orange chairs, and then you have a blue chair, and so that's descriptive that way. It's transformative because of the presence of God. And as we'll see, that's very relevant. So think of kadosh as more active than just a state of being. Right? God is unique, but as God's presence is upon a place, a building, a person, it is then almost verb-like. It is kadoshing. I don't even know if that's how you say it, but you are being transformed into a unique way. So let's see a couple examples of that before we start to get into some applications. One of the very first uses of the word is there in Genesis chapter 2, where it talks about a particular day being uniquely set apart. So chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. So even there's 2 different states of the presence of God. One is a state of transformation, right? The world, this physical realm, which is called here earth, it begins chaotic, it begins dark, void, stormy, and the presence of God, the Ruach of God that we saw last time, begins a transformative experience, what is called here God's work. It's transforming it, molding it towards better, towards life and light and peace and harmony and landscaping and beauty and so forth. So the presence of God is, through the Spirit of God, is transformative. And when that transformation is done, the Spirit of God, the presence of God now is one of ceasing, resting, completion. So God is still present and still uniquely involved. But because God's transformative presence, that part has ceased. The seventh day here is set apart from the previous six. That makes sense? I'm not going to go too deep into the Sabbath or Shabbat because we're going to talk about that later. But that makes this day set apart. So then on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, made it kadosh. Why? Because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So once again, he was a transformative presence up to then, and now his presence is one of ceasing and rest and completion and achieving. Once again, we'll get to that later, but I want to set an example there, that as an example. In Exodus 3, we have another example, verse 4 and 5. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, this is Moses out in the wilderness. He spent the last 40 years herding sheep, and God calls him at 80 years old. And there's a bush that is burning. He approaches it. And from within that bush that is burning but not consuming, it says, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is kadosh. It's uniquely different. Why is it different? Well, the rest of the landscape is the same, but what makes this geography different is because the presence of God is there. And when I've made this point last time, but think of it once again. When it says the heavens and the earth, I want you to think about the realms, two realms, the spiritual realm and the physical realm. And somehow those mirror each other and connect. But when the presence of God is there, it kind of fine-tunes and it connects those two realities. And in those special moments is highlighted in the Bible. So like, for example, the Garden of Eden, the Tree of Life, here, the Temple of God, later through Solomon. Jesus claims to be the two worlds. Jesus is walking around. He's the presence of God with us. Later, the Spirit in us is the connecting of two worlds. So those are the places that the worlds overlap, and there's almost like there's a portal. I'm starting to get all like Thor here and Avengers, but it's a good illustration. So it's when those two worlds connect. And here they're connecting, and because of that, that geography is uniquely different than the rest the mundane that Moses had experienced for 40 years. Right? He probably overlapped in this part here many times with the sheep back and forth. And then God's holiness isn't just like the dirt here is slightly softer and better than the dirt over there. Is the presence of God that sets that moment apart is because God is going to empower Moses for a very particular purpose. And so his holiness is not just philosophically true of God. It is when his holiness interacts with this realm, it's always about transformation, empowering, and giving us responsibilities. And so this is the case with Moses. Then as we move the story along in Leviticus 19, so by now Moses has been tasked by God to take his uniqueness, and it's a uniqueness that's going to be tested. God's kadoshness is going to be tested against the gods of Egypt. So in the ancient world, everybody and their dog had a god. Right? Sometimes the dog was the god. Everybody had a dog. Or a dog. Everybody had a god. Possibly a dog. Everybody had a god. Right? There was the village god, the family god, the geography god, the god of the kingdom, of the empire. And the Egyptians had a plurality of those. And so here you have this ethnicity people group called the Hebrews, and they have their God, their tribal God, and Egypt's like, whatever, fine with that. But now their tribal God, through a very old, sheep-smelling person, is coming to make challenges of the Pharaoh, who represents the mighty gods of Egypt. Now the story's getting interesting. Pharaoh and them's all fine with some tribe having their God, but when that God starts making demands, Pharaoh's like, and who is this that I should care, right? Like he's condescending about it. These are challenging words. And so is the God of the Hebrews just one more God, or is he Kadosh? Well, let's find out. How do we find out? We have a cosmic, awesome smackdown between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt. All right, we're going to have just kind of this fighting experience, and who proves to be uniquely set apart? Yahweh, right? So now the people have been freed. They are at the mount where God comes down and connects. Once again, God comes from the heavens, is on the mountain. Moses is going to do the back and forth, connecting the two realms as the anointed. And through those interactions, Moses as a representative, we have Leviticus 19, 1 through 4, where Yahweh says to Moses, Lord, and that's going to be another word, Lord, but Lord says to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel, which literally that word assembly, just you could easily put the idea of church there. It's the gathered. Speak to the gathered of Israel and say to them, be kadosh. Why? Because we're better than everybody else. Well, no. Be kadosh because I, the Lord your God, am kadosh. I am set apart. How do we know that? We just saw a smackdown, and who was victorious? God, right? Lord God. Well, okay, if God is uniquely set apart, if he is different, if he is Yahweh, verse 4, consequently, do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves, because I am the Lord your God. I am set apart. Don't go follow anything else. Don't make representations of anything else, which Israel deeply struggled ever, and in reality so has all of humanity. We're more sophisticated in our idols, but we replace God all the time. And that is a horrible mistake, because God is kadosh and nothing else is. He is the definition of set apart. Okay, so if kadosh has that meaning, any questions about that before we go to point 2? Is the meaning clear? Well illustrated? Okay, so what does that mean to us? Well, that as it pertains to those that gather around the presence of God, kadosh isn't just a moment. Like, to be holy isn't just a moment in time. It is an existence, a framework, a way of being. Okay? So as you gather, as you come to God, you are made kadosh, because just that very act, because instead of you going after the mundane, the list of gods ruler imagines and different, you're coming to the set apart God. So thus you are being set apart, because you chose the best, the unique, the definition of set apart. So just by coming to God, you are being kadosh in your decision making. I have chosen Yahweh. So now it doesn't stop there. It's my point. It must have a transformative, continuing transformative impact on my life. Because if I chose God, but then I go to a bunch of other idols, my kadoshness has been lost. I was unique in my choice, but now I go back to the mundane. I'm not unique anymore. So how do I maintain that holiness? Well, it's by continuing in the presence of God in a transformative way. Remember, the Spirit of God is not just an apparition floating around, some kind of force energy that just floats, and it is transformative. And if I'm going to come to the presence of God, I must be transformed. So the idea of like, come to God as you are is, yes, there's no other way to come to God. But as you come to God, then you're going to be transformed. And there's no other way there either. So come to God as you are is fine, but that does not mean you're going to stay where you are. Right? And so, okay, Exodus chapter 19. Here's the continuation of some of the words through Moses. So then Moses went up to God. So he goes in the presence of God. Then the Lord called him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." So that's a little poetic language there. But in other words, he's saying, you have seen how I'm unique. I'm not just a tribal God. I am Yahweh. Like, I am Lord. And I proved that to you. So the 10 plagues, or the 10 strikes is a better translation, wasn't just to show Egypt who is God. It was also to confirm to Israel that their God was not just a tribal God. And so he's reminding them, you have just seen that. Thus, verse 5, now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, once again, he's not a tribal God, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So, God creates humanity, all of humanity, not just some local creation story, all of humanity, Genesis 1 and 2. But then humanity decides to ignore the kadoshness of God and create its own gods, real or imagined. And if you haven't noticed yet, we are really, really good at dividing. Right? We divide on everything. Everything. OU and OSU, left and right, Republicans and Democrats, cilantro, those for and those against. That's a very hot topic. Of course, for is the way to go, right? We just divide. We just divide. We still do tribal stuff everywhere. There's tribes everywhere. Everybody's got their thing, their people, their color, their flag, their theory, their worldview, their preference. And we got all these smaller little subdivisions on the internet in echo chambers and all kinds of things. We started that in Genesis 4. And people just went out, Cain went out, and people just started creating and imagining their own world. And that's what all these countries are and states, and everybody's doing their own thing. Well, okay, the little lovely hashtag, you just do you, and you just whatever makes you happy, and it's sophisticated, really kind of modern, sounds modern, cool, but idiotic. And here's why. Because hashtag you do you inevitably is going to conflict with how you're doing you and how I'm doing me and how you're doing. And then we're going to start being like, Okay, hey, who's up for this worldview? And then we start gathering over here, and then you're going to gather over there, and you're going to gather over there, and then we're going to start fighting for resources. We're going to start fighting for platforms to throw out, and convince others. We're going to start associating our identity to those worldviews, and we're just going to start fighting, and somebody's going to bash somebody's head, and we're just going to go from there. Does that make sense?
It sounds like Judges when everybody did what's right in his own
Yes.
eyes.
So it's a lovely philosophical concept, but it's one prone to create violence because we're going to conflict. And if I just went and did me in the middle of nowhere, and you did that, you were somewhere in the middle, that would be fine, but that's not how humanity works. And so the uniqueness of God is reintroducing humanity to his uniqueness through a particular people group. Not because they're better, as we will see is not the case. They're as flawed as the next kingdom. But because God has chosen to be present with them, and we'll see here shortly, as an example and a call to all of humanity to come back to God. Okay? So, be holy, and you are a holy nation. So you are going to be set apart, once again, not because you're better, but because Yahweh is your God. Yahweh is working within this people group. That makes them holy. Not their brilliance, not their morality, not their resources. Yahweh, God. And you are then going to be priestly. There was a category of a particular job you could have. You could be a priest. But what he's saying here, as a nation who is near Yahweh, who has a special connection to God, you are going to be intercessors between the peoples out there and God by showing them what does it look like to have God with you. Does that make sense? And so, which already implies you got to live a certain way. And what he calls here, he says, if you obey me fully, and if you are faithful to our covenant relationship, if you're faithful to our relationship and you live in a way that reflects my presence, you will show the world something unique. You will show the world something unique. It boggles my mind when we have some real world problems. Like we got some serious issues out in humanity that deserve some serious solutions. It boggles my mind when followers of Jesus take on solutions proposed by everybody else as the ultimate way to solve humanity's problems. I'm sorry. If without the presence of God was the way to fix humanity, humanity would have already fixed itself. It's not. God's presence, and now in Jesus, is the way to fix humanity. Now, people cannot believe that and go do whatever they want, but we should not get on the bandwagon of those proposed solutions. We should come to God, and his presence in Jesus is the solution, at least that we're going to show humanity. They can do whatever they want, but we're going to show them this particular solution. Does that make sense? But sometimes we're not showing that, are we? Sometimes we're not only accepting solutions out there, we're embodying those solutions, and then we're even viciously defending them, which is the opposite of uniqueness. We're doing what everybody else already does. We're vicious, we're tribal in our approach, my people against your people kind of mentality, and it goes from there. All right. Then continue the idea in Leviticus 18. We have this in verse 1 through 5. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them," once again, this is the premise, "I am the Lord your God. So you must not do as they did in Egypt, where you used to live, And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. So keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them, and I am the Lord. Listen, humanity is free to go do whatever it wants. God created us to choose. Now, granted, we have misused that horribly, but nonetheless, go ye and do whatever you want. However, if you accept the proposal that Yahweh is offering, that he will enter into a relationship with you, and as you here is like a community, and you say yes to that exclusive relationship, you then are saying yes to live a particular way to reflect unto humanity what it looks like to be in an exclusive relationship with God. If you say yes to that, do not go living as everybody else does, is what he's saying. Because you said yes. You could have said no and then go do whatever you want. If you want to go be like the Canaanites, here's an idea. Go be like the Canaanites. Just move right over there and you just take it on, put on the colors, and live out that life. Do not, however, stay right here with God, call yourself the people of God, but really live like the Canaanites. First of all, that is disingenuous, hypocritical, and God's not going to take that lightly. Still applicable today. You want to live like the people down the street, the ethnicity down whatever, the next nation over, the left, the right, the up, the down, whatever, that is fine. Go ye and do that. If you, however, say yes to Christ and you take on the word Christian, do not then go live like everybody else. Because once again, first of all, you're being disingenuous. And two, you're being hypocritical. And three, God still does not take that lightly. So is that harsh or unfair? I think we still expect that in every area of life. If you're gonna take on the flag of the left, here's an idea: embody the left. If you're gonna take on the flag of the right, embody the right. If you're gonna claim to follow one team, cheer for that team, and so forth. Like that, it's not an unreasonable concept. Yet somehow we lose track of that when we come to Christ, or when we come to God in this particular point of the story. Okay, so keep my decrees, obey them, and in that particular moment of time, Israel was in a transition between 400 years of being under the influence of Egypt and about to move into a connection with other people groups. Do not live like this, and don't you go to these other people here and just be like, ooh, that sounds interesting, let's try that. The very next verses, Leviticus 18, is a whole list of things one should not have sex with. Why do you think that list is there? I bet because they were doing that over there with the Egyptians, or these folks over here were doing those things. So then that serves as an illustration of what he has in mind. Does that make sense? Okay, Deuteronomy 4, still under the same concept, verse 5 through 8. See, I, Moses, have taught you decrees and the laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. So now we're getting ready to go into the land. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is wise and an understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way the Lord our God is near us? whenever we pray to him. And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees as laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? So the reason we're supposed to be set apart, or kadosh, is not because we're better than everybody else, is not so we can convince the world we're better than everybody else. It's to show the world what it looks like to be in a relationship with God alone. So it's not because of us, it's because of God. So religious arrogance, by definition, is already a problem. You cannot be arrogant for something that does not depend on you. God did not choose Israel at the doom of everybody else. God chose Israel to be a beacon of light unto everybody else so that everybody else would come to God. It's very important to understand that. We were not just put on an island over here and now let's watch the world burn. We're empowered by the presence of God so that the rest of the world will not burn. So that we can be priestly unto them. We can be intercessors unto them. And they will, rhetorically so, say, wow, what a great group of people, because their God really cares. Their God's really present. Their God's really involved. Unlike all these other people groups over here, where their gods only seem to favor the rich. Everybody got it, and everybody else got the short end of the stick. Sometimes they were beaten with that stick, right? I mean, that's the world they lived in. But this wasn't what they were supposed to do, at least not Israel. And the people are going to look at them and say, man, what a great group of people, because they have such righteous decrees. Okay, the word righteous in the Bible does not just mean doing right things. It means it's a relational term. Their laws were great because it had relational implications, like fairness and justice and, and on and on and on. And you can read, now we read it and we're like, this is weird. But it really was an impressive law in comparison to that world. And still today, people that are struggling out there with bazillion things and all kinds of stuff dividing them, and social issues and racial issues and financial, ethnicity and politics and things that are just setting everything on fire. They should be able to look here and be like, wow, how'd those people get along? They have all kinds of people, different people groups there, yet they somehow get along. That kind of thing should be happening. And it's because we have such righteous relational decrees, right? Relational minded justice. Thoughts on that? Or go to point 3, questions? Everybody tracking? Right, so now let's put this in Jesus, and let's put this perspective in Jesus. The concept of holiness is fulfilled in Jesus, is really achieved in Jesus. Not that in Jesus God is finally holy, God's always been holy, but a version of what it means to be a humanity that is set apart because we're in an exclusive faithful relationship with God is exemplified and achieved in Jesus. Israel really struggled. And so do we, but Jesus exemplified that it is possible to be a human, completely and exclusively in a relationship with God alone, and live in a way that is set apart. And guess what? It is transformative. And 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the impact of Jesus. Because that's what happens when humanity finally embodies that. Now, we get to embody that to degrees because we're still kind of, struggling on this ride. But when we do, we really can still make an impactful difference on humanity. And there's been people through history that really kind of rose, not through politics or through money or through wars, because that's always at the cost of somebody. But there's been people that have really risen and had a masterful, powerful influence in the world through sacrifice and love and kindness and, you know, benevolence and so forth. And those are moments, I think, when the uniqueness of God in them reaches a certain height, and it really just has a transformative impact. You cannot have the holiness of God on you or upon us and not be transformed and not be transformative unto others. Right? So if we're not there yet, something is still struggling along. And we just need to be more mindful of that.
Well, let me ask you a question. How you be transformative? You know, this world, like you already addressed the world jacked up. I'll be honest with you, I don't want the LGBTQ, homosexual shoving their nonsense on me, my kids, my family. How in the world am I supposed to be transformative? And Paul said it's supposed to be of the world, but not of the world, you know, in the world, but not of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that transform when we got Christians speaking out against this stuff and they're losing their jobs, they're getting doxxed, whatever the heck that means. I don't have none of that, not in that technology stuff, but all that stuff.
Perhaps we're using the same approach everybody else is using. And that's maybe not the way to transform the world. Maybe the approach is flawed, where the intent is good. Instead of the approach of how every other group is trying to impose their way and to fight other certain political or whatever social issues they disagree with. In other words, trying to silence people and trying to just speak louder and trying to yell and trying to get in there and try to picket and what. Maybe there's a different approach. So it's not just let's believe different things. It's also let's take different approaches to solving issues. One way, I think, and somebody had mentioned this last time, said, oh, we didn't talk about grieving the Spirit. Well, so I included that here. So let's spend the next few minutes in it. Because it also talks, it isn't just the Spirit of God, it's this unique Spirit of God. There's a way we grieve the Spirit, and here's how Paul puts it in Ephesians 4. Do not let, so he gives examples. It's not just a concept. How are some people grieving the Spirit? At least in that particular application in Ephesus, and perhaps other ways today as well, they were having unwholesome talk, right? So do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful to building each other according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. So they're already misusing their platforms and their words. So don't grieve the Holy Spirit, with him whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Here's some other ways you've got to do this different. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice, which is how many other groups there today, still today, are trying to get their way. We can't take that approach because we're crushing the Spirit of God in us or turning down the volume on it. Verse 32, so instead, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. But that's just so passive and weak. And like, I need to yell louder. Well, maybe we don't. Actually, Paul might be quoting that from Isaiah, or at least paraphrasing it, as he says, back in Isaiah 63, I will tell of the kindness of the Lord, the deeds of which he is to be praised, according to all the Lord has done for us. Yes, the many good things he has done for Israel, according to his compassion and kindness. So what are we emphasizing here? His mighty power, his way he can, and then people burn. No, his kindness, his compassion, his good deeds, specifically here for Israel, verse 8. He said, surely they are my people. God, because he's so kind to Israel, he's saying, surely they're my people, children who will be true to me. And so he became their Savior. In all their distress, he too was distressed, and the angel of his presence saved them. And his love and mercy, he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them on the days of old. In other words, God was so kind to Israel. Surely Israel will be faithful to God. Spoiler alert, no. Verse 10, yet they rebelled and they grieved his Holy Spirit. So he turned and became their enemy, and he himself fought against them because they just lived like everybody else around them did. They were idolatrous. They followed other religious practices. They got as far as burning their children to a foreign god because that's what the neighbors were doing. And so they grieved the presence of God in them. And so they stopped being unique. So here's how we grieve the Spirit of God. When we start doing things like everybody else is. The way we speak, what we post, the way we treat others, if we act in vengeance, revenge, anger, violence. Instead, we should be doing kindness, compassion, goodness, benevolence, sacrifice, forgiveness, on and on and on. In conclusion, because that's our time, we read Leviticus 19, but Peter here is going to quote it, and here's the setting he puts it. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. And as obedient children, once again, obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is unique, so be kadosh in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. And that's what we're called to still do today. All right, next class, we're going to talk about sin and sinners. And so, sounds fun, right? Thanks for coming. See you next week.